Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, which is titled P.O.W.E R, a way to view writing. So it's an acronym that I came up with a long time ago now, and it stands for pre-writing, organizing, writing, escaping, and rewriting. So what it is, it's the way to envision writing that we can share with kids that I think is accurate in terms of reflecting the writing process that most writers go through. And we're going to explore this acronym today as a way to tap into how writing can be useful in our classroom. So without further ado, I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Chris Street. I am going to be presenting this session today. I'm a professor of secondary education at Cal State Fullerton, and I'm happy you can join me today. We're going to be focused on writing, and if you are a teacher of any discipline, grades 4 through 12, I think this will be helpful to you. So let's dive in. So the first letter of the P.O.W.E.R acronym is pre-writing. And some people balk at the idea of spending a lot of time to help kids get ready to write. But if you're asking them to write something of substance, so this does not apply to something like a quick write or a quick writing to learn activity. But if you're having them do something more substantial, I'd say paragraph length or longer, then investing some time in pre-writing to help kids get started is well worth our time. So how can we help teach kids, show kids, share with kids pre-writing strategies for generating ideas? Because so many students stand or sit, I should say, staring at a blank page and they just don't know how to start. So a few pre-writing strategies that we'll talk about. Free writing is a way to get kids started. Clustering, asking questions, listing, talking and listening, and then finally reading. All of these are possible pre-writing strategies, and I'm sure there are many more, but these are some 6 common ones. So let's quickly take a look at each. So Erica Lindemann, a writing instructor and a rhetorician, has a quote from one of her many books. As a rule, the more time students spend on a variety of pre-writing activities, the more successful the paper will be. So that's the bottom line. If we're asking kids to write, helping them get started usually ends up paying dividends at the end. So free writing in its purest form is simply nonstop writing. And oftentimes the act of writing will help the flow of ideas, and you can free yourself from all other thoughts and simply write for a set number of minutes, or maybe it's a length, half a page or something. But you will get ideas in that process. And the way I like this is that once you've generated that free write, you likely have a nugget or two. There may be a sentence or two, or an idea, or even just a single word that can really help you as you get started on the writing activity. Clustering is another one where we have 2 sides to our brains. We have the more artistic, creative side, and then we have the more logical, rational side. So clustering is a technique that takes advantage of both sides of your brain. And this technique, unlike free writing, highlights relationships among ideas. Also asking questions. So who, what, when, where, why, how. Asking questions about a topic to be explored is a nice way to generate some ideas. And here's a Rudyard Kipling poem that gets at that. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. So ideas come from asking questions. Listing, just listing ideas, putting them down in which the order in which they occur can be helpful. It's also called brainstorming, but it's another way to get ideas on paper. And then conversations, an excellent pre-writing activity is just having kids talking. Maybe it's in partners or small groups, but whether you're listening or you're speaking or both, it can be a great way to generate writing ideas. And then finally, reading. Reading in the area that you're going to be writing about can be a really effective way to generate writing ideas. So why read? We oftentimes see that students who are effective readers tend to be our strongest writers. And why is that? Well, writing is learned by imitation. And so William Zinsser's point is worth mentioning, because if kids aren't reading, then they don't have any writing to imitate. And it's an important point, and it's worth remembering that we need kids to be readers if we expect them to be writers. They need something, they need those models, they need those exemplars before they can really feel comfortable writing themselves. So it's really reading that helps. Why reading deepens your reservoir of language, enabling you to access a deeper pool of linguistic resources while writing. So what do I mean by that? If you're reading, then you have this deep pool of language that you have over years internalized. You have this deep reservoir that you can draw from, access as a writer. For example, you may not quite know how to use a semicolon, but if you've seen a semicolon used in hundreds or thousands or even millions of sentences over the years, you might have internalized the structure of when that makes sense to do that. Or a word like draconian, you might not have enough reading experience to quite know exactly what the word means, but if you find it helpful and you want to use it in your writing, you dip into your pool of language and you have a word like draconian to consider. And students who aren't readers, they just don't have that kind of grammatical knowledge of the semicolon or that deep reservoir of language for a word such as draconian to pull from. So the more you read, the deeper your pool, your reservoir of language is. So now you have some ideas. Now what? Now organizing becomes important. So you can ask yourself some basic questions before you start that might help you with organizing. In what capacity am I going to address the reader? Are you going to be, for this activity or assignment, a reporter, a provider of information, an average man or woman? What pronoun and tense am I going to use? So is this particular piece of writing appropriate for first person? And a consistent tense can really help organize a piece of writing. So are you going to be writing in the past tense for something that happened, or the present tense for something happening today? How much do you want to cover? Oftentimes students have a difficult time narrowing their focus. What style? Impersonal, personal, formal, casual? That's really important for kids to latch onto. What attitude are you going to take toward the material that you're going to write about? So are you going to try and be involved? Are you going to be detached? Are you going to try something ironic? You're going to try and make it funny? What's the attitude that you're going to take? And then what one point do I want to make? So maybe this is the thesis, but what is the single takeaway that you want to leave readers with? All those points can help kids organize their writing. Restricting rather than expanding can be really helpful. So restrict your subject. Rather than in homelessness in the United States, for example, maybe you focus in on writing about homelessness in your city. And your purpose, if your purpose is to persuade, then stay on purpose. If it's to inform, then that's your purpose. Is it to argue, to debate? So restrict your purpose to what your primary focus is for the writing. And then a few other writing restrictions that can help you with organization. This one's huge. If you can identify a specific identifiable audience, this actually drives everything. So if you have an audience in mind, you can view that audience, you can consider their needs, their wants, their expectations, how much knowledge they have about this topic. Think about your audience carefully before you start writing. What length restrictions will you be working under? And what time restrictions are you going to face? And then finally, what deadline? So all of these things are a way to help consider ways to organize a piece of writing. And sketching out a plan is a good idea. So you don't have to necessarily adhere to a strict outline. Just know where you're going and why. So some students find it helpful not to develop a robust outline in the beginning, but oftentimes it's a nice way at the end to do an outline of your own writing, just to see if you know which piece of your writing is doing what for you. So if you have an outline of 6 paragraphs, you should know what each paragraph is doing for you, either when you get started or at the end as a check that your purpose is structured and you have a well-organized piece of writing. Okay, so we've done a lot yet and we haven't really started writing yet. So once we go to the W, or the writing component of the acronym, let's first take a look at how writing is typically taught. Then we'll talk a little bit about writing to learn activities, which can be helpful in any discipline. We'll talk about the importance of drafts for longer pieces of writing. And then we'll talk a bit about paragraphs. So writing to learn. Why do we have kids writing in our discipline classes? Why are kids writing in physics or physical education or art history? It's this, that research supports that when students write in their content area classrooms, they learn more effectively. That's the bottom line. So we're not in writing to learn. Our primary purpose is not to teach writing. Our primary purpose is to use writing as a tool to help kids learn our content. So writing to learn is a powerful strategy for supporting students thinking and learning across the curriculum. That's why we see writing to learn activities happening in all disciplines. It's also a powerful strategy for showing how much and how well students have understood what they read and what is being taught. How do we know, for example, whether students understand the concepts and the ideas that teachers teach? So maybe you do something like a quick, fuzzy, clear writing activity where on a piece of paper or digitally, students really quickly come up in maybe 2 minutes with an idea that's very fuzzy. They still don't quite understand it from what you've taught, and an idea that's clear. Something as simple as that can give you a quick pulse check on whether or not your students understand what it is that you've taught that day. How do students know whether they have clearly understood these concepts and ideas? So if you did something like a fuzzy, clear writing activity, if the clear is very clear to the students, they then see, oh yeah, I got that one. And they better understand what it is that they haven't understood. And writing also clarifies our thinking. It highlights both the teachers and learners when the understandings are not clear. So if you can write about something, you generally understand it. And if you struggle with the content, then it's difficult to write about it. And this can be really, really effective for both students and for teachers. But the way that writing is typically assigned in schools that is how writing happens. It's oftentimes just assigned, not taught. So if you think about a teacher who asks students to write an essay, if the only teaching is the assigning of the essay, then it's important to think about, how am I teaching my students to do this well? How am I supporting them? Am I taking them through this whole writing process to give them some structure, some guidance on how to develop ideas and organize their writing and draft their first drafts? So we really need to think carefully about not falling into this trap of just assigning writing rather than teaching it. And responding to students' writing, very important. If we're grading students' work, giving them feedback, we really need to find an appropriate balance between support and challenge. So on the one hand, they need us as the more capable experts to provide them with a challenge of giving them feedback that will push them further and develop their skills. But they also need support. They need to feel like we're on their side. So how do we do that? One way is to use a coaching and a positive tone rather than a critical and a judgmental one in your responses. And then give students substantial feedback before they turn in their final drafts. And I saw a question in the chat about this. Somebody was asking, when is the best time to give students feedback on their work? And in my mind, it's right here. It's before they turn in their final drafts. So a couple of assumptions with that. One is that you will allow students to use the feedback that you've given them on their drafts to make changes, make improvements, and revise that work and turn it in again. So if you are willing and able to do that as a teacher, and I really hope you are, because I think that's the best way to teach writing, is giving kids feedback before they turn in their final drafts. Make sure they understand the feedback, and then they have an opportunity to use your expertise, your hard work in the feedback that you provided to make changes, make improvements, and turn in a better revised draft to you. So good question in the chat. This is really important because what we as teachers mark determines what students value in writing. So what do you think this means? Just take a few seconds and jot down your thoughts in the chat as a response to this question. Why is it that what we as teachers mark determines what students value in writing? Okay, so a couple things came out of the chat. We had a couple people mention that if we only mark with a red pen mistakes, then students internalize that and they say, oh, that's what my teacher values about writing. I have to make sure there are no grammatical mistakes, because then my teacher will be happy with what I've created. A couple other people said negative comments is something to be wary of. And I agree, because if we are only putting down on students' papers negative marks, then they're probably not going to value writing. They're probably going to become fearful of writing. And sadly, this is what so many students experience, that we only, as teachers, we tend to focus on surface level errors. We tend to mark mistakes, and we tend to give a lot of criticism. Typically, if you look at research on praise to criticism on student writing, it's about 8-to-1 criticism to praise. So think about that balance. We talked earlier about that balance between support and challenge. Is it truly supportive? Is it balanced if we're giving them feedback that is 8-to-1 negative over positive? Hugely important, because our kids' identities are going to be largely determined by how we teach writing, how we talk to them about writing, and what we write on their papers. So rubrics can help. If you are interested in developing your own rubrics, Rubistar is just one of many sites you can get to for free and develop rubrics that will help you assess your students' writing. So this is just a few of the templates that are available. You'll find hundreds of options online for places to generate free rubrics. And there's all kinds of rubrics. So we're not going to spend a great deal of time on rubrics today, but just a few points about them, as it can really help define what you value in writing if you're using rubrics. So responding to students' writing. And I like this one, came out of a question that was in the chat as well, about getting an audience for their student writing beyond just the teacher. And this is really important. You don't have to be the only one responding to students' writing. You can have kids writing to authentic audiences. Maybe it's a school board, maybe it's someone in their community. It's an email to an author of something they've read. There's tons of ways to make the authentic writing work in your classroom, so that it's not just you as their teacher that's responding to their writing. They actually have a real world audience that's going to be responding, we hope, to what it is that they've written. Couple other points about responding to students' writing. It's a good idea to limit the number of comments that you make on students' papers and to limit the complexity of them. So kids can become overwhelmed if we have covered their papers with red marks or any colored marks and comments that they might not quite get. So I like to think of 3, my favorite number. I like to focus on 3 areas on student papers. So 3 easily understood areas where if the student addresses these 3 points, it will make an immediate positive impact on their writing. And at least sometimes try and do the writing yourself. See what it's like to be a student with the task you've given them. There's no better way to get a real feeling for what you're asking kids to do and how doable it is if you try it yourself. Plus, it helps them see you as a real person, a real writer, somebody who's also struggling with the task. You know, feel free to talk your way through the task and share with your students when it's trouble, when there are troubling areas for you that you have to work really hard to work through. That's good for our kids to see that even we as the experts struggle with writing. So Peter Elbow says he recommends a set of guidelines and a scale for evaluating students' writing efficiently while at the same time providing them with needed feedback. So how do you do that? How do you give good feedback without it taking you forever? So Elbow's point is give fewer levels of grades, using 3 at most, something like strong, typical, and weak, or thriving, developing, and emerging. Whatever your categories are, 3 are enough, he says. Let kids see the grading criteria before they hand in their work. So ideally up front, you and your students in a perfect scenario would develop or help co-craft a rubric together. And then they have buy-in. They understand the language of the rubric because they help generate the rubric. Maybe you do this on a big projection system in front of the class or on the whiteboard, but have your kids help you create the rubric. And if you don't do that, at least go through the rubric with them and help translate that teacher talk in the rubric to student talk so that they understand what you mean by, for example, evidence. Make it clear to our kids what we expect. Peter Elbow also says fewer graded assignments is okay. Remember, you don't have to evaluate and grade everything students write. Sometimes it can just be for practice. And then on the next slide, we'll see an example of a grid or a table that he likes as a simple way to give feedback. So something like this, 3 areas: strong, typical, weak. And then your characteristics or your criteria for writing in the far right column could be whatever it is that you value in that assignment. And then there's room at the bottom for some commentary. So as a teacher, for example, clarity, ideas, insights, thinking, if this is a strong, then you would just click strong and maybe a check mark. So you're check marking each area of the rubric. And then at the bottom is your spot to insert something that is more personalized for each writer. So they have a sense of what they did well, what they need to work on, and maybe the final comment could be a reminder of something they are thriving at and kind of encouraging them to take this to the next level. I really like that hamburger approach where it's hit them first with something they're doing well. In the middle, your second comment might be something they need to work on. And then your third comment could be another positive, something they're doing well and perhaps a way to make it even better. So when we are responding to students' writing, we need to think about providing models of effective and ineffective pieces of writing. It's really helpful to have kids share as a teacher lots of examples of student writing so they can be shared with your students and they have some models, some exemplars that they can look at, and maybe even some ineffective pieces that you use without names, of course, for class discussion. How could this particular piece of writing have been improved according to the rubric? So as I mentioned before, I just think it's a really good use of class time to use the rubric to assess and the strengths and weaknesses of sample papers. So ideally, you might have a really weak paper, a typical paper, and a strong one that you can use to help kids understand the rubric in terms of what does a weak paper look like and why? What's a typical paper and why? And then finally, what's a strong paper look like and why? Really helpful. So you might say to yourself, well, I am an art history teacher. I'm a mathematics teacher. I'm a physics teacher. I teach history. How am I going to provide good feedback on student writing? I wasn't trained as a writing teacher, and you don't need to be. You do not need formal training in writing to assess students' written work. You have all the expertise necessary to determine clear from unclear writing in your discipline. So think about that. Probably have a very, very clear sense of what it means to be a clear writer in history, what kind of evidence is used in physics, what kind of short, precise language is valued in mathematics. So you have the expertise necessary to determine clear from unclear writing in your discipline, and that's a nice place to start. You are qualified to require clarity and to teach it in your discipline. So, as I mentioned before, and there were a couple of questions in the chat about this, about do we need as teachers to be grading everything because of the time burden? And absolutely not. Not every free throw taken will determine the winner of an NBA championship. Most free throws are taken in practice. So lots of practice, and kids do not have to receive feedback from you on every single thing they produce. So consider that. Some of what kids are doing could just be for practice. So in the drafting phase, helping kids see that when you're drafting, you're really experimenting. Convince yourself that you're working in clay, not marble, on paper, not eternal bronze. Let that first sentence be as stupid as it wishes. So give kids permission to experiment, to take some chances when they're drafting. It's just that. Drafting is just that. It's drafting. It's this stage. We are writing, not polishing. Polishing will come later. So the first draft, let it be a first draft, and we will have lots of time to improve that work as we go. And then a bit about paragraphs. So I like this point by Erica Lindemann. From the reader's point of view, paragraphs make promises. What does that mean? Well, for me, what that means is each paragraph is going to focus on one major idea. The promise of that paragraph is that you, as the reader, will be introduced to and taken through one major idea. So if a paragraph is all over the place and trying to cover too much content and too many ideas in one paragraph, it breaks the reader's trust. It doesn't fulfill the promise of one main idea per paragraph. So keep that in mind. It might be helpful to share wish students that idea. And I really feel, and William Zinsser is my favorite author in terms of writing, the craft of writing. He has a book that's been out about 40 years now called On Writing Well. And it's by William Zinsser. He was a writer, he was a professor, taught writing at Yale. And I really love this quote, that good writing doesn't come naturally, though most people seem to think it does. It's a myth that everybody who's an effective writer they just have a gift. It really does take hard work. So hopefully this POWER presentation has given you an acronym that might be helpful so that we can guide students through what can be a very difficult and overwhelming process for them, and kind of break it down, give them some structure, some guidance that will help them as they develop as writers. I also like this. Careful thinkers make careful writers. So if the reader is lost, it's usually because the writer hasn't been careful enough. So we do need to be careful as writers. That's why we have lots of time for drafting and then revising and then polishing and feedback from the teacher with an opportunity to revise. We need to be careful as we can as writers, and with the time and effort and feedback from teachers, we can help kids improve their writing, which will cause them to appear to be more careful as writers. And it will be more clear for readers to follow their writing. So escape. Now that we have written, how important is it to get away? Very. Give yourself time to get away. Have fun and come back to it later with fresh eyes. This was my oldest son when he was maybe, 4, 24 now. But I just like his inviting smile. Like there is more to life than grinding out a piece of writing and never taking a break. So have some fun, get away, come back, see it again with fresh eyes. You will see it differently. And then finally, the last element of the acronym is rewrite for R. Rewriting is the essence of writing well. Students don't really want to hear this message. They don't quite understand it because students oftentimes just want to get it done and turn it in. But professional writers often spend much more time revising and rewriting than they do writing. So, and William Zinsser makes this point in his book on writing well. Rewriting is the essence of writing well. And again, the key for students is that we give them as teachers our feedback before the final draft is done. And so they have an opportunity to rewrite with our feedback in mind to help them improve. So what's the difference between revising and editing? We'll tackle that next. Revising the piece is reading with the eyes of a reader, okay? Revising is reading the piece with the eyes of a reader. So kind of big picture stuff. Does this make sense? Where did you get lost? What do you need to know more about? Thinking about it as a reader. Editing is closely focusing only on the words on the page. So the editor is focused just at the sentence level. You know, is this comma misplaced? Is there a better word choice here, for example? So revising and editing are not quite the same thing. They are quite different. Here's an example of revising. Using the cut and paste functions on the computer to move blocks of text around. So you might find out when you're writing, oh, this sentence belongs somewhere else. I'm going to move it. That's an example of revising. You're realizing this is kind of a big picture change that I need to make. An example of editing is the spelling grammar check. That's just focusing on the words on the page, not the overall message from the reading or from the writing, I should say. So some final thoughts. I love this quote again from Zinsser. You won't write well until you understand that writing is an evolving process, not a product. So it's the process that this acronym focuses on. The POWER acronym is all about process, but it helps students improve their product. And then finally, my quote, I don't like to write. I like to have written well. Writing is hard work, and I don't relish the idea of having to write an academic paper because I realize it is challenging work, but I love the idea of having written well. So I'll stop with that and I'll pause for a few minutes. We'll take some questions, and I hope that you got some good information out of that POWER acronym today.